We're going to look at some very deep, very challenging, disturbing, and controversial aspects of Greek mythology. When I say controversial in scholarship, there's quite a lot of back and forth, quite a lot of argument over whether the idea that the Greeks did grasp onto the idea of a dying god, a god who could be torn apart or otherwise killed and come back to life, is really a valid way of viewing Greek mythology. I'm going to argue that, in fact, it is, although I do that with some hesitation. And I'll try to explain why the controversy in scholarship has arisen, why it's important, not just something that scholars do to keep themselves amused, but something that really does get right to our grasp of what mythology is for and how it helps illuminate the human experience. We're going to look particularly at two figures in Greek mythology, Attis and Adonis. But I actually want to take us back to Dionysus. You may remember that in one of the versions, one of the stories about Dionysus, as a baby he was taken off to Crete. He is the son not of Zeus and Semele, but Zeus and Persephone, and he goes by the name of Zagreus. And Hera is as jealous of this union as she was of her husband's extramarital affair with Semele, and she incites the Titans to destroy little Zagreus. They distract him with some toys, and then they tear him apart, and they eat him. A gruesome story. Zeus blasts them with this thunderbolt, and Athena saves his heart, from which is reborn Dionysus. So there, not to be too simplistic, is a story of a dying god. It was particularly important, that version of the myth, to the Orphics. We will not have a whole lot of time to look into that that very interesting set of legends around myths around the story of Orpheus and the theosophic religious experience of the Orphics, who believed that they had a special knowledge that would give them some conquest over death, a better place in the underworld than the uninitiated would have. But getting back to the point of the Orphics, we do have here a version of the story of Dionysus in which death is conquered by the god, and that is important. Now, in the interest of being responsible as a scholar, I do want to acknowledge that one of the great figures in the understanding of Greek mythology of the last century, Walter Burkert, whose works you've heard me cite, strongly feels that the whole idea of a dying god is a real misconception. And he says, with a little bit of sarcasm, that unfortunately the belief is so popular that even if it's destroyed, it will rise again. The belief in a dying god is itself a kind of a dying god. I'm going to argue that the problem there is that Walter Burkert is identifying the idea of a dying god pretty narrowly with the agricultural cycle. And in that regard, he's quite correct that the stories don't really match up with this change of the seasons and so forth. But in the wider sense of gods who die and come back, the understanding is one that really does help us to penetrate into the world of Greek religion and Greek myth. And I'm actually starting with the story of Attis because it's clearly not a perfect dying god, cyclical kind of story, but it does show these elements of destruction and rebirth. It comes, like so many of the Greek myths, from a Near Eastern origin. Agdistis, who is very much like Cybele in Greek mythology, springs from the earth and he is hermaphroditic. But the gods remove the male part, and it's important to know that there are Near Eastern divinities like a bearded Astarte, who's a fertility goddess. So that this kind of hermaphroditic vision of a deity is not at all unusual, and is a certain key to its Near Eastern origin. Now, when the gods remove the male parts of Agdistis, or Cybele, they bury it, and an almond tree springs up from the buried male member. And its blossoms are fertile, and they impregnate a woman called Nana, and she gives birth to a baby named Addis, who is exposed but suckled by a goat, much like the stories of baby Zeus being suckled by a goat. Well, Cybele, the great mother, the earth mother herself, falls in love with the beautiful Addis. She's very jealous of him, and when he shows affection for someone else, she drives him mad, and he castrates himself. He cuts off his male, genitals, and he dies. But Cybele is so grief-stricken, she prays for him not to decay, and Zeus grants that wish. So he doesn't exactly come back to life, but he doesn't disintegrate like a normal mortal. The Addis cult is a very vigorous one in the ancient world. Here's a rather remarkable statue, Roman statue of Addis, life-sized, found in the port city of Ostia, which is a major port very close to Rome. And you can see he's very handsome, perhaps a little bit, the way the statue is carved, a little bit effeminate, but a person of great beauty. The cult of Addis has a number of features that certainly do suggest the idea of death and rebirth. The priests are eunuchs. They are castrated, and they're castrated with a flint knife, which really does take us back to a kind of a Stone Age ritual. And Burkert certainly suggests that this is a way to ensure that they're going to be loyal to the cult. They don't have anywhere else to go, and might even protect them in warfare because they're seen as non-combatants. The ritual for an initiate of the cult of Addis is a pretty horrifying ritual. A bull is led over a grate, and with a special spear is killed, and its blood pours through the grate on top of the initiate, who emerges completely covered in blood, and in a sense kind of reborn, coming out of this this particularly gory ritual of being covered with the hot blood of the bull. There's an interesting parallel that both the genitals of the castrated priests and the bull that has been castrated are buried in a similar fashion, which takes us back to something that we've seen in some of the other myths, the idea of the hunter becoming the victim. In this case, both the bull and the human being treated rather similarly. The priests would go in procession and flog themselves, bleeding profusely, and it does suggest a kind of submissive and passive role. They only eat meat, the initiates into the cult, which again suggests a profound hunting connection, almost pre-civilized. And the Galloi, the priests, bring in pine trees from the wild, which once again a reminder of a pre-civilized manifestation. There are a number of threads that are coming together here. clearly there is a element of the hunter's ritual, the expiation of the hunter's guilt. It's clearly very ancient. The use of the flint knife, the bringing in of the trees as if the wild has returned. But I also would suggest that in this story of Kibble causing his madness, his castration, his death, and then making sure that the body doesn't disintegrate, and the initiates into the cult coming out of this gruesome ritual of being covered with blood and emerging from underneath that grate. This does have an element of death and renewal. Burkert, as always profound, sees in it the antinomies of the successful, namely civilized people, wanting to be reminded of their inferiority, and that by submitting to that, they can actually avert catastrophe. A kind of way of evening out, as we see in the in some of the rituals of hunting, that the hunter in the ritual also becomes the victim. As Burkert says, the ancient ritual was to play out the antinomies of despair and hope, humiliation and superiority, in an attempt to reestablish a balance of life. The point that I would like to add, pushing back a little bit against Burkert's rejection of the idea of a dying God, is that there is also that element of rebirth, of coming back. We're now going to move to the myths and rituals surrounding Adonis. You've probably heard that term Adonis used of a particularly handsome man. He's an Adonis, as a way of saying he's just gorgeous. And Aphrodite falls in love with him. And here we have this wonderful late 19th century painting of Aphrodite surrounded by her little cupids, her erotes, kissing him awake. Now, you may remember, if you read the Hippolytus carefully, that Artemis pledges that in revenge for what Aphrodite did in taking her beloved Hippolytus away, she's going to get one of hers, and it's going to be Adonis. In this 17th century painting by the artist Titian, we see Aphrodite clinging to Adonis as he rushes off to the hunt. Well, the hunt is going to prove fatal for him. But before we get to the sad end of Adonis, and indeed his rituals of resurrection, let's look at the Near Eastern origin. The name is clearly coming from a Hebrew or a Canaanite root. Adon means Lord in Hebrew. And in a parallel Near Eastern story, Dumuzi, or Tammuz, book of Ezekiel, you can see that name. There's a rooftop ritual of lament for him. And in the Adonis cults, there is also a rooftop lament for the fallen Adonis. Now, there was an old theory that Inanna, or Ishtar, went to the underworld to bring him back to life. But in fact, what we find is that in newer texts, she came from the underworld to destroy him as a substitute for herself, so as a kind of a surrogate victim. But Dumuzi's sister gives herself so that he would have more life. We're already beginning to see some of the idea of a God who can die and come back. In the Greek story, with a certain psychosexual element, a woman named Mura, or Smyrna, has an incestuous passion for her father. She does manage to satisfy her desire, but he discovers this and chases after her. She is turned into a myrrh tree, and the tree gives birth to Adonis. Aphrodite gives him to Persephone to guard, but he is so beautiful that Persephone refuses to return him. And Zeus gives 1/3 of the year to Aphrodite, 1/3 to Persephone, and 1/3 that he himself will decide. This in and of itself should suggest that we have here the idea of a figure who can be with Aphrodite and with Persephone, the queen of the underworld. He is killed by a boar during the hunt, and there are different versions of the myth. In one, it's Ares who's jealous of him because he's beautiful, and Aphrodite, who is his lover, is more in love with Adonis at this point than with him. And we already spoke about Artemis taking revenge for the death of Hippolytus by destroying Adonis. And there's even the idea of Apollo doing this in revenge for Aphrodite's blinding of his son. He dies in the arms of Aphrodite, and the blood that drips to the ground becomes the anemone flower. But the story does not end there. I believe I've given you in Blackboard a poem by Theocritus, a Hellenistic poet. And there, I'm going to read you a few lines. It's very clear that the women are engaging in a ritual in which they see the god returning each year, or I should say Adonis returning each year. The poem is set in Sicily, in the Greek city of Syracuse, where the ritual is taking place. And here are some verses from it. Lady who loves Golgi and Idalium and the steep of Eryx, Aphrodite of the golden toys, see how after 12 months the hours have brought back to you Adonis from Acheron's ever-flowing stream, Acheron being the river of the underworld. And a little further in the poem, in Adonis's rosy arms the Cyprian, that's Aphrodite, lies, and he and hers of 18 or 19 years is he. The golden down is still upon his lip, his kisses are not rough. And now farewell to Cypris as she clasps her lover. But altogether at daybreak with the dew we will bear him out to the waves that plash upon the shore, and there with ungirt hair, breasts bared, and raiment falling to the ankle, we will begin our clear song. You, dear Adonis, alone of the demigods, as they tell, you visit both earth and Acheron. Such a lot did not fall to Agamemnon, nor to mighty Ajax, the hero of the heavy anger, nor Hector, nor Patroclus, nor Pyrrhus, and so forth and so on. So there in the ritual, clearly the idea is that he is going to come back to life, at least on an annual cycle. And they would celebrate this by setting little Adonis boats with vegetation afloat into the harbor of Syracuse. Sir James Fraser records that even in the 19th century, Christian women would put Adonis boats out to sea at Easter, connecting the death and resurrection of Jesus with the old, ancient Greek myth of Adonis, probably not even knowing its origin, but thus did a ritual from Greek antiquity survive all the way into just about modern Christian times. So let's go back to the theory of the dying god. The myth of resurrection of Adonis is limited. although the ritual is that we just saw in Theocritus 15 is clearer. But note in the Near Eastern parallel how his sister helps him in that story, in the story of Dumuzi, the parallel for Adonis. Also think about the idea of baby Adonis being given to Persephone, brought back to light, killed by the boar, and then the annual rituals with the sprouting of plants, putting them out to sea, doing that every year. So even if the vegetation parallel doesn't work out well, the question I ask is, can the idea of the dying god be cerebral, be an intellectual one, rather than an agricultural one, in which case it is indeed one of the very comforting ideas that not just the Greeks, but so many other civilizations have developed, that things that go into the ground are not there forever, that just as we do see with John Barleycorn, and here we do have an agricultural metaphor, that things do come back to life. There is a cycle. And again, I invite you to think about Eleusis, that what gave the initiates so much comfort when they thought about what will happen after death was looking towards the way a seed could come to life. And the fact that we can't put these rituals in exact parallel with the agricultural cycle, I think is a fine point that doesn't really cause us to reject the idea that the dying god is a comforting and very real part of mythological thinking.